Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Performance Driven Academy webinar. We are about to get started. If you are just joining us and you haven't had a chance yet, please look into the chat box and fill out our quick 2-minute feedback survey about webinar 2 and the tools there so that we know if those were useful to you, and if not, how we can improve moving forward so this experience is giving you what you need. We are excited to be at session 3 of our Performance Driven Academy. Today's topic is best practices in human resources. This PDA is brought to you by the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, which I'm sure you all know is a partnership between McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research and CASA, the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse. I'm Brianna O'Connor. I'm with CCSI Center for Collaboration in Community Health, the upstate partner of MCTAC, and providing hosting for today's webinar. Even shorter than before, a little bit about the PDA, what we're doing, why we're here. I did want to say regarding the feedback that you guys are providing us in between webinars, whether it's via the chat box, which you can send in at any time, through our email address, pda@ccsi.org, or through the survey, the 2-minute feedback survey that is in your chat box. We are really looking at that feedback and figuring out what we need to evolve as this goes forward. So there was some information about some questions about how do we translate this information for organizations who maybe aren't as far along in their evolution as a performance-driven organization, and also some questions about how do we turn those collaboration best practices more internally and use those internal processes as well. And so both of those were kind of key pieces of feedback we gathered from our last feedback survey and some feedback we've received, and we have kind of revised how we're approaching the in-person days coming up in the end of March to make sure that we're addressing those things. So we really are looking at your feedback every time you send it in and thinking about how we can adjust things moving forward so that you're getting what you need out of this, and we're answering questions. As I said, please feel free to chat in at any time. You can chat in questions for the presenters, or you can chat in any comments or concerns you have about the topic matter, and we'll get to them as appropriate. Today we are approaching our performance-driven organization puzzle. We are talking about human resources, which as you can see here is one of the processes that's really critical to becoming a performance-driven organization. Through the PDA as a whole across both semesters, we'll really be hitting on all of these components that you see here to really understand how an organization, from the culture on up to the collaboration, all the processes and infrastructure in between, really needs to function. What are those best practices as they become performance-driven? This is where we're headed right now on our roadmap. We have finished the first webinar on culture, the second webinar around collaboration. We are currently at human resources. After human resources is our in-person picnic tables, so that's when we're all meeting together across the state. There's 3 different opportunities. Obviously, you only need to register for one, although we do need every single person to register so we can plan for tables and lunch. And then after that, we'll have an optional office hours to sort of review what might need to happen for your organization, kind of tailor that individually. And then we'll move into part 2 of our first semester, which is really all around effective measurement. So that's where we've been and where we're headed on our Performance Driven Academy road trip. Today we're talking specifically around best practices in human resources, and I'm very excited to welcome Stephanie, who's going to provide the best practices conversation for us. We do have our agency perspective coming later, and with that I will turn it over to Stephanie and let her tell you about herself.
Great, thanks Brandon. Thanks everyone for having me. Good afternoon. You'll see on the slide there my background. I actually have 2 positions. I'm actually here representing my second position in consulting, but I spend most of my time at Epilepsy Prelude as the Vice President of Administrative Services and Corporate Compliance, and that includes overseeing 5 different functions with HR included in there. My background is in human resources. That's where I have spent my entire career. I also made a footnote there that I was selected to lead the work group at Prime Care Coordination for HR and Workforce Transition. So I've been involved in the managed care setting from that perspective and getting quite an appreciation for what it's going to take to prepare for value-based payments. So I was happy to speak to you today based on that as well. In my consulting practice, I am a co-owner with my sister. We do leadership consulting, coaching and training, and also professional organizing. Today's learning objectives are 2. So we're going to explore 2 methods to leverage human resources concepts to influence the shift to a performance-driven culture, and you do that in 2 ways. You can change the system and change the people. Effective performance-driven cultures do both. So a few disclaimers before I proceed. First of all, trying to distill HR practices into about 30 minutes is nearly impossible. So I've given it a shot, but I just want to let you know that it is way broader than that. And the typical answer to any HR question is, it depends. And so that's something you want to keep in mind as we proceed. Also, I've assumed here in my discussion of HR practices that there is a robust goal-setting process. I've listed a few bullets of recommendations there, but because effective measurement will be covered in the second semester, I wasn't going to go into detail, but I did want to just reinforce the importance of having that process in place. And finally, the information presented today represents a combination of my experience, education, research, and original ideas. So I have cited my sources where applicable. Okay, so in the first webinar, John Lee told us about accountability, which, as you saw on the first slide briefly that had my name on it, I have titled myself the Accountability Evangelist. So I told you about my jobs, but my real passion is accountability, so I was very happy to have that tie-in. And he mentioned that accountability for improvement exists at all levels of the organization. Everybody needs to know what is expected of them and have the information to know whether they are achieving what is expected. So the HR practices shown here support that concept. It's important to see that these practices are part of the overall system of HR, part of the continuum of the employee life cycle. And as such, for the system to be effective, performance expectations must be consistently reinforced throughout all of these practices. So we're going to go into detail in all of these now. So the italicized bullet at the top came directly from the Human Resources slide in Webinar 1. So job descriptions reflect expectation of measurement and continuous improvement to assure best possible performance. So my first recommendation for you when it comes to job descriptions is to take advantage of the distinction between job postings and job descriptions. So often we miss that opportunity, but I want to tell you about the differences between the two. So a job posting is something you use to articulate why a qualified candidate would be excited about the job. You use this to help fit, right position, and it should be something that's fairly creative, should be concise, fairly short, and a compelling advertisement. So it's really a recruiting tool. The job description, on the other hand, is more of a list of qualifications. It's an important document, but it's very much straightforward. It's very specific and thorough. The two tools are much different, and I'm going to show you an example of the difference between the two in the next few slides. So in my spare time, I am on the board of the Rochester Fringe Festival, and I helped out with converting the job description to a job posting for this particular position. And so I'm showing you here, this is the description itself. So I didn't write this description, and I don't find any problem with it, but it is in fact a description. So if we were to take this description and post it on Indeed or somewhere and expect people to apply, I'm not sure we would get the best candidates, because it's really, frankly, kind of boring. It just tells you what you're doing. So contrast that with the posting that I created. Now, this is only a subset of the actual posting, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for this. When you talk about things, explosive growth, I mean, right away, you're drawing somebody's attention in. And the intention here is to put yourself in the shoes of a candidate who might want this job and who's going to thrive in it, and get them excited about it. So I just took the bullets you saw on the previous slide and tried to put a creative twist on it, which was particularly important for the Rochester Fringe Festival because it is a very creative endeavor. And so in your organization, you might take a bit of a different twist, but either way, do not miss the opportunity to make this an advertising tool. All right, but let's go back to the description itself. So what it should be, the person needs to know what they need to know, do, and deliver. Okay? I've listed a few examples here of the types of expectations that you can put in job descriptions, and I put these in here because I think most people embrace the typical description elements of exactly what they're doing, but these types of things are more about soft skills, or at least that's what they're called, but they're really important. And typically I find in human resources, the reason people leave their jobs is typically because they don't do this type of thing well. So they need to know that it's expected of them, and it should appear in the job description. And for supervisors, the last bullet gives you something I implore you to steal, if you like the language, to put in there and let them know that they're expected to lead, develop, and empower their staff members. All right, the next HR practice is performance appraisals. And here's some tips I'm leaving for you. First, keep the form brief. Okay? If you've ever filled out a performance review and been a supervisor in that role, you have probably sighed in frustration when you sat down to write it because it was 3 or 4 pages long. I highly recommend keeping it brief because done is better than great. Okay, so in this case, it just needs to be done. It doesn't need to be perfect, but if it's 4 pages long, no one's going to do it. The language should be consistent with the job description, established goals, and the organizational values. Like in the job description, supervisors should have additional measurements to evaluate their leadership behaviors and execution. So I recommend having a slightly different form for the supervisors. And finally, if you can, offer a self-assessment feature. So give the employee a chance to evaluate their own performance and calibrate that against what the supervisor thinks. That's a great tool for that. And finally, and this is the most important in my opinion, define and honor the rating system. So if you have a scale that has meets expectations, or if it's a 1 to 5 scale, you probably have a 3. You have to know what the difference is. How does meets expectations differ from does not meet or exceeds? Now the time to tell them is now. So if you're on a calendar year cycle, tell them now, not in December, okay? Because it's December, it's too late for them to do anything about it. Make sure they know what the difference is. And then when you get to the part where you have to rate people, if the person is inconsistent on a particular element, then you really can't give them a rating of meets expectations because you're sending the wrong message. You have to have the courage to say what's really going on. Similarly, let's say you have 5 elements in your performance appraisal and 4 of them are not meeting expectations. You can't give them an overall rating that meets expectations. Now, I say you can't, but I can tell you that I've seen a lot of people do it anyway, and typically it's because they don't have the courage to just tell the truth. But why is this so important? In the 3rd bullet there you see, when define and honor is done well, it allows for the integrity and fairness of an absolute rating system versus relying on relative comparisons to peers. What I mean is, people will just appreciate and accept what their rating is, and it's not about, well, I gave John a meet, so I need to give Sally a meet. It's not that type of thing. So if everyone knows what they expect and you honor that, then you can be fair. All right, professional development. So for professional development, I recommend the use of an individual development plan. So this is something that's different from the annual goal setting process, but it's just as important. So what you have is in the format, it doesn't matter what it looks like. I use a particular form, but it doesn't really matter. It's the content that's most important. You have a couple things. First, you want to list the strengths and development areas. Now, you can typically get those out of the conversations you've had with performance appraisals. You also want to list career aspirations. So those 2 things, so you have strengths and development areas typically kind of paired together, and then career aspirations, meaning what does this person want to do in the next, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? You take those 2 sets of data and you marry them to specific actions that will be taken to leverage the strengths and address development areas, which increases their effectiveness in their current job and gets them ready for future roles of interest. So the career aspirations piece is pretty important because you have to know where you're going in order to get there. So you might, if you choose a role, for example, if I want to be a CEO, then my actions I choose might be different than if I want to move over into residential services, for example. So that's something that's really important. And finally, similar to the self-assessment, when it comes to the performance appraisal, I recommend that the supervisor employee each draft the IDP separately, then they come together and discuss and agree on a final document that both people fully support. If you don't discuss and agree, then it's hard to assume that both people fully support it. I think most employees don't want an IDP handed to them. They want to be engaged in that conversation, and actually I feel they should be driving it. Recognition. All right, this one's a little tricky. So it can be effective if done consistently well, but there are a lot of landmines I want to caution you around. So let's start with cash. Cash means just the money in their pocket. So if you have access to salary market data, I highly recommend that you use that, because that gives you an objective input that you can use to determine what's fair in the marketplace. And then the other side of the coin is analyzing internal equity among people in similar roles. If you can tie dollars to performance, that's great, but it has to be consistently and fairly applied. So once again, establish metrics and honor them. So if you establish a metric that a person has to hit 100% of their sales goal in order to get an incentive payment, and they get 80%, don't give them the incentive. Otherwise, the whole point of incentive compensation is lost. But it, again, takes courage to do that. On the non-cash side, excuse me, thank you goes a long way. So it doesn't have to cost you anything, but you do have to do it right. So you have to be specific and timely. If someone does something well today, try to catch them today or tomorrow. Don't wait until their annual performance appraisal to tell them that they did a great job in this webinar 8 months ago, right? That it doesn't work very well and it doesn't reinforce behavior. Regarding recognition programs, some people use them and some people don't. So if one's in place, what I mean is some employees will use them more than others. So it's not an accurate reflection of what's really going on. That's one of the reasons I don't like recognition programs, because some people are just better at it than others. Some people just naturally recognize when people need to be recognized, and others need a lot of prompting. But you do want to provide an easy method for them to do that, especially peer recognition. If you don't have a program yet, I recommend seeking feedback from employees before implementing it, because you might put something in place that they don't want by making an assumption about something. They might just want movie tickets, and you might be thinking, oh dear, we have to do something more grandiose. So find out what they want. If your program already exists, monitor the effectiveness and get feedback. You have to freshen it up regularly, because after people get all excited about it at the launch, and then they forget about it. So you have to remind them frequently. All right, corrective action. Who's on the bus? So the last bullet on the human resources slide from webinar 1 said, willingness to take action on those that cannot meet expectations after multiple training or retraining efforts. This slide reinforces that requirement. So this is pretty important, and I suspect where some of you probably have the most angst in your role is, what do you do when someone's not working out? Well, let's start with talking about the overall issues first. So the first issue is right person, right seat. And you might say to yourself, how could that possibly be an issue? Well, it's not. In fact, you want everyone to be the right person in the right seat, but they can get disgruntled if you ignore them. So you still need to pay attention to these people and encourage them to contribute to their full potential. So asking them for input, keeping them engaged. The right person, wrong seat means they're a good fit for your culture, but they're in the wrong job. If that's the case, then give them clear feedback on what needs to change, or if you can, find another position that would be a better fit for them. If it's the wrong person, right seat, so what this means is this person is acting in a way that violates your organizational values, but they're getting results. And I know several people in my career that I've come across, and typically they hang out longer than the rest because no one wants to get rid of them because they're performing. But if you define performance as results and behaviors, which is how I define it, then they're really not performing, and you need to tell them that. So you have to tell them that how you get results matters as much as getting the results. Finally, wrong person, wrong seat is probably a hiring mistake, but either way, you have to act quickly to deliver feedback with clear expectations. Because if you delay, they start to feel like I'm doing fine, and then you come out of nowhere, at least from their perspective, and tell them they're not cutting it, and they're saying, well, what do you mean? I've been doing fine this whole time, you haven't said anything. So the consistent message with all of these issues is you have to be on it. You can't delay. I know it's something people put off because it's uncomfortable, but you have to be on it with all of these things. Now, if you are, and you've done everything you reasonably can, and it's not working out, then you need to talk to your HR department about using your progressive discipline or performance improvement process, and hopefully that will work. And sometimes it does. And one comment I want to make about performance improvement plans that sometimes know it's PIPs, they are not a termination tool. They actually work. That it's a way to give someone more structured feedback and help them get the support that they need. Now, if that doesn't work, you're probably at an exit, and at that point, it's really important to make sure it's respectful, and there's a way to do that. You do not need to treat them like a criminal. There's a way to be very appropriate with them, and you should talk to HR about how to do that if you're not sure. Okay, but how do you know? Let's talk a little bit more about, we talked about right person. How do you know if you have the right person? So here's a tool that can help you figure that out. The spectrum of performance is a diagram I created to help articulate the specific behaviors that a role model will demonstrate and the results that are to be achieved in each of 5 elements of self-leadership. In addition, behaviors to avoid are described in the weak link section on the left-hand side. At the top, you see, as I mentioned earlier, performance is defined as including behaviors and results. So from there, we first focus on accountability. Of course, the accountability evangelist is going to put that at the top. I believe that's the fundamental leadership behavior that, in my opinion, underlies all others. I chose the 5 elements based on my experience and observation about what makes a good employee, and I actually created that when I worked for Bausch & Lomb, and I've tweaked it just slightly since then. It seems to have stood the test of time. So the reason I put the weak link descriptors is I find as much as I want to talk in the positive all the time, people sometimes just don't get it. So they need to know, what am I not supposed to be doing? So I have both here. So you can use either one. And it's a great tool. You can use at performance appraisals. You can use it with your IDP planning. I've seen people post it up on their wall as a reminder. It's a good place to remind them of the aspirations they could have. But also just want to say that not everyone is expected to do all these role model behaviors all the time. Everyone has a bad day. But generally speaking, they should be hanging out on the right side of the diagram. And if they're not, then they're probably not the right person, which brings you back to the slide before. Okay, so keeping with accountability, let's talk about accountable culture ingredients. So this is, again, my opinion. I believe they are coaching, communication, and consequence, with communication being the most important. So let me start with defining coaching. So coaching is the desire and pursuit of continuous growth. I firmly believe this is not something where the employee should have coaching handed to them. The employee needs to be engaged. Okay? Just like it says in if the communication call out, joint responsibility between sender and receiver. I find in my experience employees expect to receive things. They sit back and the leadership, the quote, they, are supposed to be the ones delivering everything. But in an accountable culture, that's not the case. In the webinar number 1, two-way communication was highlighted, and John stated that staff members are routinely given the opportunity to ask questions and share their thoughts. I highly endorse that, and I would take it a step further to say, in a truly accountable culture, staff members create these opportunities and don't wait for them. So the leadership should create the opportunities and continue to ask the questions, provide the forums, but at the same time, if an employee has an idea, a question, a concern, they should come forward. But they're not going to do that unless you set the tone through an accountable culture. And how do you do that? Well, consequence is really important. What I found in my accountability evangelism is that coaching and communication tend to come a bit more naturally and comfortably than consequence. But you have to have all 3, because if people are not doing what they need to be doing in your culture, you need to hold them accountable. And in order to do that, you have to find a meaningful consequence. What do I mean by that? Well, each person is different, each situation is different. In order to change, you have to find what is meaningful to that person, and that's what you want to leverage. All right, so since communication is so important, let's talk about how to give feedback. This is a great model that I borrowed from the Center for Creative Leadership called Situation Behavior Impact. The best way to explain it to you is just to walk through the examples. So example number 1, situation. For our last 3 staff meetings, behavior, you arrived late. Impact. The meeting did not start or end on time. People were frustrated by having to wait and stay later than planned. Okay, the reason I like that example with this model is you'll see in the middle it says, describe the behavior, do not interpret. Now, another way to say this feedback could have been, you are disrespectful at staff meetings. But if you had said that, then the person would probably get upset, get defensive. No, I'm not. It'd become an argument as opposed to just laying it out there objectively. This is what happened. This is the impact. And basically what you're really saying is, what are you going to do in response? So put the accountability in their lap. This also works in the positive. So here's a positive example, number 2. A visitor arrived at our office yesterday. You paused what you were working on, greeted him with a smile, and asked how you could help. He reported having a positive impression of you and our organization and shared his experience with others. What's important to note here is the specificity of this. So you might be tempted with positive feedback to get a little lazy. You might say, you're great with visitors, okay? And if I said that to the receptionist at Epilepsy Prelude, he would be so excited. He'd probably stand up a little taller, be all happy that he got a compliment from a VP. But would he do it again? I don't know. But if I tell him exactly what he needed to do, and this is what you did, and this is what I saw, and thank you very much, and please do that, he's going to repeat the behavior. So that's a great form of positive reinforcement. All right, control versus influence. So the second webinar referenced the fears and challenges associated with collaboration. So I believe that people are concerned that we'll be taken advantage of and that others won't do their part. And I think that's part of fear in collaboration, is they just think that, well, you know, I'm going to end up doing everything. But the beauty and the simplicity of accountability is that if everyone focuses on what they can control themselves, many of these fears and challenges are easily addressed. Personal accountability is also critical to establishing trust and respect, which was reviewed by Brianna in the attitude and approach slide in webinar 2. Control versus influence is a key concept I teach every month to new hires at Epilepsy Prelude during my presentation on leadership. Rather than teach them how to lead people, I teach them to be leaders by being accountable. Accountable people are better leaders and are easier to lead. Therefore, in my opinion, a focus on personal accountability is the most effective and efficient way to develop employees and improve performance. So if you missed it, we have transitioned into the part where you change the people, from changing the system to changing the people. And this is a concept I reinforce constantly. In fact, I even took it to my daughter's career day when she was in 3rd grade and taught it to them. And they all were anointed as accountability ambassadors, because even at that level, they can understand the difference between control and influence. So once they do that, I challenge them, everyone, with the following questions. What am I doing or not doing that is delaying or preventing my personal or professional success? So you see the mirror there. You know, that's not an accident. It's on purpose. So instead of the tendency what people do is to point out the failures and faults of other people, I'm always challenging people to turn the mirror around to themselves and say, what is it that I'm doing? And why do we do that? Because you can only control yourself. And by controlling yourself, you influence others. So I push them on the first question, then once we answer that question thoroughly, I ask it again in a different way. What else can I do to rise above my circumstances and achieve the results I desire? So just for a personal example of this, some years ago I was struggling with fitness, or at least I felt like I was at a fitness plateau, and I was complaining about how I didn't have any time and I couldn't do this, and you know, the world's against me and all that. So I finally followed my own advice and was thinking about, well, what's going on here? What can I do? And I realized that in my mind, I had this mindset that the earliest time of day was 5:45 a.m. and no human being awoke before then. So I refused to get up earlier and go to the gym earlier. And but then I realized, well, wait a minute, people do that. It's okay, you can do it too. And so I cold turkey one day just started getting up at 5 o'clock, and I have to tell you the first 3 weeks was really painful. But since then I have been doing it pretty much every day, and it's actually hard for me to stay in bed past 5 o'clock. But that's just an example of kind of getting out of my own way, you know, that you should consider when you're putting the mirror in front of you. Is there's always something you can do. You might not want to do it, but blaming your circumstances on other people is not an accountable thing to do. You have chosen not to do something, and that you should be accountable for. That's part of owning your circumstances. Oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry, I know what I did. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So now this brings us to the tool. I did give you kind of a bonus tool within the presentation of the spectrum of performance, but the actual tool is the accountability assessment. So it's an elaboration of the definition of the role model behaviors that you saw in that spectrum of performance. It's very comprehensive and it's practical specific behaviors. So let's take a look at it. This is going to be available to you as the tool itself, but right now it's in the presentation in 2 parts. So it's a quick assessment. This is meant to be filled out by the person as opposed to, it wouldn't, I originally created this and I thought, well, maybe the supervisor and the employee could fill it out, but it just didn't seem very accountable to me. As I just talked about control versus influence, it really should be about you. So All you do is put your name and date on there just so you can keep track of your status and when you actually evaluated this, and you say yes or no after each statement. And it's about consistent behavior, so this is one of those things you're meant to do quickly. Don't hang out a lot on any one thing. If you consistently do it, put yes. If you don't consistently do it, put no. This is really just a self-assessment. So I'll just highlight a couple points about the different categories. For responsive, don't make people wonder if you're going to do something. Keep them informed. Okay? Professional. Another word for professional in this context is thoughtful. Accountable people are always thinking about their impact on others. Appropriate sense of urgency. Put people at ease by signaling a higher level of priority and importance when the situation calls for it. Deliver on promises and requests. The core skill set here is time management. I have never met a person I would anoint as an accountability ambassador who struggles with time management. It's really fundamental. In fact, I do several courses on it just on that topic alone. So that's something I highly recommend working on if that's something you struggle with. And finally, own contribution to circumstances. So I talked about that a little bit on the control versus influence slide. Accountability is about acknowledging that you're an active decision maker. So you're not, life isn't just happening to you. You're not passively encountering it. And that doesn't mean that you're always going to make the right or best decision, but it does mean that when you make the decision, you're taking full responsibility for it. And remember, deciding not to do anything is still a decision. Okay, so that wraps up the content here on best practices in human resources, and you see my contact information on that page, and thank you again for having me.
We actually, so thank you so much, Stephanie. This was really, really great information. We had a few questions that came in while you were chatting, and so I think just to keep things sort of with you while while we're all thinking about it, I'll ask you these couple, and then we do have a really great opportunity to talk to Howard Hitzel as our agency perspective in a moment, and we'll continue taking questions. So if you have ongoing questions, I'll ask just a couple that we have, and then please continue to chat in questions for either Stephanie or Howard, and we'll have a few more minutes at the end for questions. But a couple of specifics about your section. So one question is for an agency that might have both the job description and the job posting, when does the job description come into play? Is that around the interview, or how does that get woven in as a process?
Okay, yeah, good question. So I would definitely recommend at the interview stage, because the earlier the better that you tell them what's expected of them. You want to put that in place. In the recruiting phase, it's a little early. Like in the advertising phase, I would say definitely go with the job posting. That's how you hook them in. But the second that you start talking to them, either on the phone or in person, I highly recommend handing them the job description then, because it also has more detail. A job posting, you don't want it to be too long, so we obviously have omitted some specifics that they're going to want to know about.
Great, thank you. Another one about specifically around performance reviews. So the question is really around timing. So is it beneficial to do performance reviews more often than annually, or is there a possibility that if you do it too often, you know, say quarterly, that could be detrimental or overwhelming to staff? What's your perspective there?
So I think I'm accustomed to the annual because it's typically associated with a rating, and a lot of organizations it's associated with a compensation. Now, where I work now, it isn't. So I've had both experiences. And I would say from research and the best practices in the HR field, they would say ongoing dialogue is the best. So if you can support quarterly, great. But again, make it short, because it becomes overwhelming if you have this long form that you have to do 4 times a year. As far as a middle ground, I would recommend a mid-year review. So what I've done in most of my organizations is we have a formal annual review and a recommended mid-year review. So from a supervisory perspective, what I attempt to do is write up a mid-year review as if it was the annual review, because then at the end of the year, guess what? I only have 6 months of work to do. So there's actually benefit on both sides for the ongoing dialogue and the work the supervisor has to do, because there's a lot of research about the recency effect and the halo effect, and what I'm referring to is if you do an annual review and you haven't really had an ongoing dialogue, the tendency is to rate people based on what happened in December, for example. So that's the recency effect, and the halo effect is when you take something that someone did really well and you base the whole review on it, as opposed to a more a fair, objective assessment about their whole overall performance. And the flip side to halo, by the way, is the horn effect, when you take something, a mistake they made, and you make the whole review about that. So if you are doing a review more frequently, you can avoid a lot of those issues.
One more, so related to kind of the staff evaluation, what is your perspective on, supervisory staff in an agency? Should they be providing only a self-evaluation, or would it be recommended that maybe an annual review be a combination of maybe the self and their staff, by the staff supervisor?
All right, so I'm interpreting that to be when supervisors are getting a review, like a person in a supervisory role is getting a performance review on themselves. Is that how you interpret it?
That's how I'm interpreting it, and if the person who wrote the question has clarification, please type that in.
Okay, so I wouldn't treat the supervisors differently than anyone else. I think there should be a self-appraisal portion to it. What I had mentioned earlier, I'll reinforce that. Supervisors should have an extra portion that talks about their leadership behaviors and execution. But as far as the values or the other elements that are in the performance review, everyone should be held to the same type of standard or evaluated in the same criteria.
Okay, thank you. I think some of this, please keep sending your questions in. I see that there's a couple others that are coming in, but I think that this really bridges well with some of the work that Howard has been doing at Best Self around performance, that his agency's been doing around performance evaluation perhaps, and so might kind of shift the conversation there, and then we'll come back and ask more questions if there are some at the end as well for either of them. So with that, I'd like to just shift gears a little bit and to have our agency perspective. So Stephanie was able to provide a lot of those best practices and really great hands-on tools. And now we have Howard Hitzel on the phone, who is going to give us sort of the perspective of how an agency is approaching this, how his agency is doing that. So Howard, if you are unmuted, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Fran. Yes, I'm Howard Hitzel from Best Self Behavioral Health, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome, Howard. What we thought we would do today is have just a little question and answer for Howard about what his agency is doing around these areas. So, Howard, if you could speak first, from your perspective and in your opinion, what are some of the key issues around human resources that organizations who are seeking to be performance-driven should be thinking of and are facing?
Yeah, well, Stephanie gave made a lot of good points in terms of some of the, I think, the basic requirements of a good HR approach. So, I think her point about being very clear about expectations. I think we're in an environment right now where there's a lot of changes going on, and I think increasingly we're demanding more and more from our staff. And I know, many organizations are also very challenged by with recruiting and getting an adequate number of qualified staff applying for important positions. So, so I think we have to. I think that being very clear about expectations is absolutely essential at this point in time. And then I think, in addition to that, providing the staff with the training and supervision and support that they need in order to be successful. I think that, we invest a lot in all of our employees, and we want to do everything we can, I think, to ensure that they're successful. And I think that really comes down to that training and supervision. I think Stephanie made the point about giving people feedback early and often. I think is a good point. So, yeah. So I think especially in this very kind of challenging environment we're in, giving people feedback in order to head off problems and kind of guide them in the direction that we need them to go. I want to say also, I think that, Stephanie mentioned value-based payments. So all of our organizations, I think, are going to be more driven by outcomes and are going to be held more accountable. And I think really informing our staff about what the demands being placed on the organization are, I think that's critical. And then helping them understand what their part in our being successful will be, so that they understand that we're in this environment where accountability is critical to our success, and that we're being we're going to be held accountable for outcomes with our consumers. And so, I always talk to our employees about, everybody has a part to play in our success, and helping people understand what their part is and what exactly, how they can exactly contribute to that, I think is important.
Really great point, Howard. I think we hear that a lot, and we get some feedback sometimes from folks that there's just so much going on, especially from MCTAC's perspective, that it can be very overwhelming for staff. And I think your point about making sure that information is communicated carefully and that everyone's role in the success of the organization are really critical pieces.
Yeah, I think there's so many things very often, and I think also just making sure that people are clear on what the real priorities are, what it is that they're the most important aspects of their job and their performance are.
Right, great. I know Best Health has a workforce committee that might be kind of participating in some of that how do we disseminate information conversation. Could you talk a little bit about that committee, how it was developed, kind of what they focus on, what they do?
Yeah, well, we really, as some people may know, Best Health is really the product of a merger that happened last June between the former Lakeshore Behavioral Health and Child and Adolescent Treatment Services in Buffalo. And so after the merger occurred, we had the task of aligning a lot of our policies and procedures, including our approach to human resources. So we decided at that point in time that rather than make this a top-down kind of endeavor, that we would get a group of interested employee volunteers to form a workforce committee and kind of walk through our personnel policies and see what we can do to kind of align them. And the process really involved, very often policies were very, very similar. But there were some areas of significant difference. So it allowed this committee to kind of explore those differences, weigh some of the pros and cons of the various policies, and then reach a consensus on how we wanted to try going forward. And I think that really helped us with some greater buy-in from the staff who had a say in what we were doing. And I think we really probably made some much better decisions as a result of the efforts of the workforce committee.
Are there other tools that Best Health has either thought through or is planning to use or has started to use around some of the performance-driven HR practices?
Well, we're in the process of, Stephanie said a lot of good things about performance appraisal, and I do think that that's absolutely critical to an accountable organization. And so we've been in the process, and the Workforce Committee has been involved in developing an appraisal tool that everybody is happy with. We were talking about what the frequency was, and we do an annual review based on people's hiring date, actually, rather than just a calendar period of time. And that was at the preference of supervisors who wanted to have evaluations spread out across the year rather than having to do a lot of them at year end. We also incorporated a 3-month and a 6-month evaluation for new employees in order to make sure that people are getting feedback about their progress in their position, and it gives us a formal means of addressing any concerns that a supervisor might have, and also provides the employee with more direction around what we're looking for.
It sounds like that really takes advantage of some of that, providing feedback, early and often, as you mentioned, for new folks to get kind of acclimated to the environment.
Yeah, and I think by making it a formalized kind of thing, we make sure that everybody gets a fair chance at getting feedback from their supervisor.
For the last couple of minutes here, Howard, before we wrap up our webinar here, can you talk a little bit about any other sort of barriers that Best Health has encountered and how you might have approached or are thinking about approaching overcoming them, or any kind of wisdom for fellow providers around how your organization is really approaching or tackling some issues in resources.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really liked about Stephanie's presentation was that kind of her identification of those key HR practices, the job description, and I think that I hadn't been familiar before with the a significant difference between a posting and a job description, but I really liked that premise because a posting is almost a marketing tool. It's almost really trying to get people excited about the job and encourage them to apply. Whereas the job description is more of a detailed enumeration of what people's responsibilities are going to be. So I like that, but I think that a job description, good job descriptions are really necessary. The performance appraisals, taking corrective measures, this is something I think that supervisors often struggle with. As Stephanie had said, I think there's very often a tendency to procrastinate or not give people timely feedback when they're struggling. And so that's something that we're always trying to train supervisors to, that it's that communication early on. And really the goal is always to help people be successful. It isn't intended as a punitive thing. And again, every time we hire somebody, we invest a lot of resources in bringing them on board and making them part of the organization. So our goal always is to help people be successful. I also think the notion of recognition, we do have and again, this came out of our workforce committee. There's a peer recognition program that we have within the organization. It's called #BestSelfAward, and it provides a mechanism for employees to recognize their peers in their program who are just kind of going above and beyond what might be expected. So there's a number of criteria that people can be awarded or recognized under, and some of it's just simple things like showing kindness to a consumer, going above and beyond, being an exceptional team player, being solution focused in dealing with issues in the program. And there's about 8 different categories. So people can recognize a peer, can submit a nomination for a peer, and then at the end of every month, we publish everyone that was nominated, and there's a drawing for prizes at the end of each month. So a certain percentage of the applicants get some kind of prize, and it really has helped. People find that to be fun, and it's a good way to kind of develop some positive feelings among the staff. The other thing I think is the professional development issue. We hire a lot of young people. We hire a lot of community-based folks in our organization. I think that, to their credit, very often people are looking to better themselves, whether that's through training or formal schooling, and I think it's our responsibility to provide opportunities for development and advancement within the organization. So I think having those conversations, and I agreed with what Stephanie said, that should really originate with the employee and then be kind of developed and supported by their supervisor, so that we're all on the same page and we kind of understand what people's aspirations are. As an organization, we do everything we can to give people flexible time to go to school or be involved in trainings, to move around within the organization to areas that are of interest to them. So I think that professional development is also a secret to a successful, accountable organization.
Thanks so much, Howard. Really great information and examples of some of the ways that you guys are really embracing some of these principles that we've talked about. There's a couple questions that have come in for both Stephanie and Howard that I will give over to you guys in just a moment. But while they're doing that, if there are other questions for either or both of our presenters, please feel free to chat them in. The first one for both of you is, are there any thoughts about what an agency can measure to help a performance appraisal be sort of as objective as possible? Howard, would you like to?
Sure. Well, I think some of this is I think and a lot of this kind of comes down to and this is where we've struggled with having kind of relevant performance appraisal tools, is because across the organization there's just incredible variability in terms of what people's jobs entail, and sometimes there's very clear, for example, productivity expectations or those kinds of things. So I think a lot of it comes down to just very observable work behaviors, and some of it is kind of do they function well as part of their team? How do they communicate with other people? Are they dependable? And then some of it's more concrete, I think, in terms of what are they expected to do in terms of the quantity of work, if that can be defined. And those are always tricky kinds of things. But also quality of work. Are they doing a good job? Is the quality of their work satisfactory? And then there's always issues around compliance also. We making sure that everybody, we're regulated by many entities, and making sure that we are compliant with all the regulations and rules that we're subject to is important.
So I'll add to that, thanks Howard, that I'm just going to refer back to a couple comments I made before to tie it together here. So the goal setting process is the best place for quantitative metrics, in my opinion, and you would tie those to organizational goals. So I would start there, but also we talked about defining meets versus exceeds. I wouldn't shy away from these intangibles. Like if you define it the way I did in Spectrum of Performance, it's okay to measure people based on that, even though it's an interpersonal skill as opposed to I've achieved 95% of quota. It's not only okay, it's encouraged, and that's really where it comes down to. Again, I mentioned most people end up leaving organizations because of those types of skills. So we can't be afraid to measure them based on it, even though it's a somewhat of subjective assessment. You make it as objective as you can by setting the expectation up front. So I mentioned putting it in the job description ahead of time. I gave you some examples on some of the language I would recommend. And taking some time to use really good language will help you get as quantifiable as you possibly can.
I like Stephanie's reference to, I think you said supervisor courage, because that's really what it is. It's the ability for a supervisor to be straightforward with employees and do an honest assessment, a fair assessment of their work.
Well, thank you both. I think this has been a really productive conversation for folks. We had a lot of questions come in for you. I'd like to thank you both for your time on this webinar and providing your input and your resources to this conversation. Last couple of slides for folks, so to kind of take action on some of the information that you heard of today, some of the great examples and ideas from both Howard and Stephanie. Our takeaways, so the things that we would suggest that you can go and do with your work group right away to sort of make first steps or further steps on your HR component. So if you need to catch up, obviously catching up on webinars 1 and 2, they certainly all are isolated, but also really work together as a path. So if you're kind of playing catch up still, we recommend that you do that first. Next, you'd want to select maybe one particular position that's typically available within your organization and try to develop a compelling job posting based on the job description. This is something that, again, taking a look back at it, I know sometimes when I look back at the job description I was hired with, I say, oh wait, we need to edit that. So make sure if you need to revise it to reflect kind of current status of things. Then within your work group, you can really work on that internal collaboration piece using some of those internal collaboration best practices that we spoke about in webinar 2 to really work on like a group writing exercise around how you would revise this job description to be a compelling job posting. Another takeaway that we would suggest is to have each work group member individually complete that accountability self-assessment, and then to the extent that you're comfortable within your work group, really openly discuss areas of focus or things you want to work on for yourself. Again, being accountable to yourself about what those goals are. So in a few months, have everybody sort of report on their progress on their own self-identified goals. The other thing that we would really, really strongly encourage you to do is to register for the in-person events that you are attending. Every individual person needs to register for the event that they are attending. Obviously, only one of them, Albany, Rochester, or New York City, but we need to know how many folks to have seats and food for. So please register for those if you are planning to attend those. What we're hoping to do at the in-person events, what we're planning to do, is to take your feedback about these first 3 webinars and also really provide some more hands-on, in-depth work around some of these topics with your work group. So we do recommend that the full work group comes to the meeting so that you have some time to work together on some of these topics. We'll also be providing additional information about these topics, additional tools and resources, and really kind of having a lot more hands-on interactive experience and opportunities around these topics. Also mark your calendars for the webinars upcoming in part 2 of semester 1 on effective measurement practices. The dates are there. They're in all of the links we send you, but just make sure you get those on your calendar so you don't miss out. That is all we have for you today. If you do have any comments, any feedback, any questions, feel free to email us at pda@ccsi.org. And with that, we will leave you and hope to see you all at one of the in-person events, and wish you all a happy afternoon.